a number of foreign accounts pertaining to the women who were dedicated to temples. Okay. So besides that, of course, the courtesans. Now, what is significant is recent scholars have also tried to show that the temple women or the Devadasis had become firmly established as exponents of performing arts, both music and dance, by actually 13th century. So the importance of music and dance as a service of the Devadasis in the temples was recognized to such an extent that it was widely prevalent. So it was recognized to such an extent that many of the large temples had separate Natya Mandapams, dance halls. Okay. So this was a part of these mandapams had also become a part of the architectural features within the precincts of the temple. Okay, within the all located within the prakara of the temple itself. In the temples, their duties involved Nartana Sena, besides offering, rather performing certain ritualistic duties, several ritualistic duties like Kumbharati and Artis were common, and then of course, making garlands and all these kind of tasks in the temples, and also maintenance tasks in which they were involved. Some of them also had certain administrative duties also in the temples. And these women also accompanied the deity during processions. So they held a very privileged status in the temples, and yes, they were next only to that they stood next to that of a priest. So they were actually a distinct community of women because they were different from the other women in the society. They were very well versed in music, dance, Sahitya, Shastras, as well as a number of rituals. There were several among them who were writers, storytellers. We hear of storytellers even in early modern period also. So the status held by these women, it could be said, had no equivalence with any Indian woman or European women for that matter. So while they were usually it so happens that in a patriarchal society, it is the wife and the mother. They're shown as very devoted, and they are actually glorified. We have these accounts of all of us as students of history would have read any topic, any chapter, or of any period begins with this is usually a subtopic on the status of women. It begins with women held a very high status. So it was some kind of a glorification that came to be attached to women, but mainly women in the domestic space. But insofar as the Devadasis were concerned, wantonness was attached to the Devadasis. Yet the Devadasi company of the Devadasis was sought by by men of higher echelons in the society, and they also enjoyed the company of these women because the women were learned, and at the same time they were also sought for maintaining non-conjugal sexual relations with these women. So it is clear that there was this kind of a relationship between the Devadasi and her patron. But what is unclear is as to when there was a transition from a very celibate and an honored life of a Devadasi to non-conjugal relationships with high caste patrons. And this may have happened over a period of time. But it also became, in course of time, one of the most exploitative practices. So among them, there were two types, I could say, that is women attached to temples, as well as women who were attached to the royal courts, the Devadasis, and then those attached to the royal courts were known by the name Rajadasis, Ganikas, Bhogastris, and of course, in the English parlance, it was the courtesans. So in a largely patriarchal society, I'm telling you, in a largely patriarchal society, the Devadasis lived in quasi-matriarchal communities. They possessed sufficient autonomy. They had their own customs, conventions, panchayats, laws of inheritance, and they could bequeath their property. They were wealthy too. So they could bequeath their property to their biological daughters daughters, as well as to the adopted daughters who could inherit. And they were the only section of women who could inherit, a privilege which was not there for women of the other sections in the society. So they were economically empowered, and this may also be gathered from the valuable donations that came to be made, and we have a good number of inscriptions to speak of the kind of works of piety as well as public works that came to be taken up by these women. Anyway, let me cut short that and come to the topic proper. So, ever since European gaze fell upon the there is some disturbance. There is some disturbance going on.
Hello, participants, please mute your audio.
Sir, please audio mute ಮಾಡ್ರಿ, video mute ಮಾಡ್ರಿ sir. ಯಾರು ನೀರು ಕುಡಿತಿದ್ದೀರಲ್ಲ?
Sir, please mute your audio, please, sir.
Yes, ma'am. Continue, ma'am.
There is some din. Okay. Well, anyway, ever since the European gaze fell upon the dancing girls, this kind of the perception they had about the dancing girls veered from fascination to derision. Okay. So it is this aspect that I will be focusing upon, at least insofar as the British and the French accounts are concerned, and how they came to be perceived even in the arts. Okay. So significant is we have travel accounts, missionary writings, paintings, and importantly, in Europe, insofar as the ballets were concerned, or the operas and musical compositions were concerned, I'm saying in Europe, Devadasis became a theme. Okay, that I shall be discussing later. So it is the travel and ethnographic accounts that are available in India, European accounts, where they have covered, I'm sure many of you would have read some of the works, land, then the people, we get topographical details also there, the habits, society, economy, as well as the culture of the people. So in the eyes of ordinary Europeans, they found India to be very strange, very exotic. And so did the paintings. The paintings also focused on some of these aspects, landscapes. Actually, large number of paintings are on landscapes, society and people. So the images presented came to be perceived as Indians being uncultured, uncivilized. So these became actually stereotypes in the imaginations of the Europeans about the Orient. In fact, Syed in his Orientalism also says that it is our begotten stereotypes, and it permeated the modern world. That's what Edward Syed also says. Well, in the travel accounts, one of the earliest to make observations of the Devadasis was, of course, Marco Polo, who was in the Pandyan kingdom towards the last decade, 2 decades of the 13th century, around 1280 to 1293 or so. He does refer to temples, and they're spoken of as monasteries, where there are large number of idols. And then he also speaks of, I'm talking only of Devadasis, no other aspect I would like to discuss here. So he also makes a reference to young girls being dedicated to the temples, to the god of the temple by their parents. But significant is there is no derision. See, that time there was no derision at all in his writings, and he says that these women, temple dancing girls, went to the temples only when they were required by the superiors to perform dance and music. And they also prepared food and offered to the deity. So this kind of a reference we come across. And later, of course, coming to Vijayanagara period, we have a large number of references in the accounts of the foreigners. Of course, Paez, Barbosa, Nunes, Pietro della Valle, and well, they all speak of the dancing girls and attached to temples, as well as the ganikas or the courtesans. So we find the details of the performance of their arts, be it dance and music, and of course, most important, it's not just the temple, but it is the Mahanavami festival that is highlighted, and their performances over there. It is the wealth of these women, the Ganikas, Devadasis, the privileges they had, and even the descriptions of their living quarters also is found. In fact, the very well-known historian of Karnataka, B.A. Salathora, writing in Social History of Vijayanagara, he says that no description of Vijayanagara women may be deemed adequate without mention being made of the courtesans, unquote. Well, speaking of missionary accounts, of course, I'll be taking up one or two only here. The first account was of John Montcorvino, who came to India around, rather, he was in Madras and later in Colombo in 1290s. He was there. He was an Italian Franciscan. And but he makes no mention of the Devadasis, absolutely no mention. Anyway, it is Abbé du Bois' account, ethnographic account, Hindu manners, customs, and ceremonies. What is evident in his account is he provides sufficient details, and what is evident is the scornful perceptions insofar as the customs and practices of the Hindus, especially the religious practices that he speaks of. And like most of the Europeans, in a highly moralistic and disparaging tone. Okay, he describes temple dancing girls also, and in the description, he finds them as lewd and licentious, and even states that their dance forms and music are lascivious and erotic. So this is his kind of a description insofar as the dance and music of the Devadasis was also concerned. He also says that it is not uncommon to see even sacred temples converted into brothels. Okay, that is the word he uses. Dubai, who had actually, after having left the Tamil regions, probably he had come and settled in Ganjam near Srirangapatna. Okay, for nearly a quarter of a century, he stayed there, and he was like a Hindu sannyasi, dressed in a similar fashion, and used to wander from place to place. And interestingly, he come across in this ethnographic account of his the Basavi system, and he says it is peculiar practice found in that region. But anyway, later it was also found in the census reports as well. So the Basavi system he describes as the monks of both the Shaiva and the Vaishnava sects. So Basavis came to be dedicated to both the Shaiva and the Vaishnava sects. So the monks of both were most exploitative insofar as the young women who were dedicated to the deity were concerned. So among the Shaivas, he says they were called as Linga Basavis, and among the Vaishnavas, they were called as Garuda Basavis. So he also describes as how the Linga Basavis had that emblem etched on their thigh, while the Garuda Basavis had the symbols, Vaishnava symbols etched on their chest. So he speaks of the kind of an exploitation that was taking place insofar as the temple priests were concerned. So though he describes the Devadasis Yeah, in a very denigrating fashion. At the same time, he says that they were decently clothed, particularly careful not to expose any part of the body. But he immediately falls on a defensive and says, God forbid. This is the word he uses. I quote, God forbid, he says, that he had no word in defense of their modesty. See, this is the term he uses. No, not in defense of their modesty. So, in fact, he portrays them as being very promiscuous and as prostitutes. And in fact, this is a feature, or rather, the descriptions that we come across in most of the missionary accounts, insofar as the Devadasis were concerned. So his judgments, insofar as Indian society, Indian culture, were of much value to the East India Company, at least for those who were coming as civil servants to India. It was of much value. And even for those who were public, who were actually curious about India. In fact, this work was also purchased by the East India Company for 2,000 star pagodas during Bentinck's time. Now, if this purchase had to be made, it was only with Mark Wilkes, okay, impressing upon Lord and Lady Bentinck of its relevance. So anyway, the board of directors also preferred to buy it, and then it was stated to be by the board of directors of great public importance. This is the term that was used. Anyway, it concretized British attitudes towards Indian society and culture, and particularly about the Devadasis. Well, with expanding the French and English colonization of India, performing arts of the Devadasi or the dancing women did not go unnoticed by the French and the English rulers in India. There were ambiguities, which particularly in the strongly worded documents too, ambiguities were there in all the accounts. And the perceptions were both negative as well as positive insofar as the French and the English were concerned, particularly the English, which were highly negative. And French accounts, of course, it is the missionary accounts like that of Dubai, which was quite negative too. Anyway, well, if we take up many of the narratives about the Orient, Western accounts of the Orient, it becomes obvious that there was a growing interest about the Orient. And now, of course, India per se, I can say, among the Europeans in general and among the artists. So I'll come to that again. So besides Abbe Dubois, the missionary, we have another English missionary from he was a London missionary, Maurice Phillips. He first worked in Salem, Coimbatore, and later in Madras since 1862. And very interesting is his writing, The Evolution of Hinduism. And so he also goes in for making very denigrating statements again. Well, anyway, so he also recognized that they were recognized prostitutes of India. So while acknowledging that these women were well accomplished, they could read, write, and exponents in performing arts. But he also says that one of the reasons why there were objections against women's education, female education, was that people did not want their daughters to become dancing girls. So this is the reason he gives. But of course, we have several other factors which could be attributed to it. But he says this, he points out as this one factor that was responsible for it. So such missionary perceptions produced the necessary impact upon the white rulers, the British rulers in India. Uh, Regarding another ethnographic account, we have Francis Buchanan's journey from Madras through the countries of Mysore, Canara, and the Malabar. And it is in Volume 2 that he gives descriptions of the prevalence of this practice. Okay, he's most critical of this society and the customs of the people, and particularly, of course, dancing girls and their musicians. He says that the dancing girls belong to a separate kind of a caste. And all handsome girls, this is the kind of generalizations we find. All handsome girls are instructed in dance and music, and all are, he says, prostitutes, at least to Brahmins. He further says that every person traveling in the region would be conducted to their quarters with music and dance. He further says, under the company's government, those attached to two temples, okay, that is the Devadasis, attached to temples of extraordinary sanctity, is what he says, are reserved entirely for the use of native officers who are all Brahmins, he says. So he provides very fleeting descriptions of music and dance in a highly disdainful manner, I could say. And the lyrics of the songs, he says, he finds at least to be very offensive, obnoxious. And of course, he also says that the music is very harsh. But one practice, which of course also found references to in census reports as well as in Thurston's and Rangachari's caste and tribes of South India, was that of the Moilar practice. Moilar practice was in the Tuluva, in the temples of the Tuluvas, he says. So according to which a widow or even a woman who would be having no interest in continuing in the continuing the conjugal life would come and partake the food offered on the Balipitam. Okay, so if she would partake the food, she would be consecrated to the temple. And then she would also be, it is like she being married to the deity of the temple, and she would, he says, be available to men of the upper caste. He also says that women who get labeled as prurient and to magnet, okay, even if they belong to the lower caste, could come and partake the food, and they would be attached to the temples. Okay, same thing is, of course, found a mention in the census reports too, as I said. Well, there again, he speaks of these women being exploited by native officers as well as priestly classes, all of the upper caste only. Well, in the 18th century, if we take up many of these accounts, one exception, at least in the 18th century, where a different perspective came to be offered, was of the people, their life, the topography of the country. It was Hafner. Okay, Jacob Gottfried. No, he was a Dutch. Okay, he was working as a bookkeeper in the Dutch company at Nagapattinam and Sadraspatnam. And he observes, he is not censorious at all insofar as the Devadasis are concerned. And he observes that Devadasis were not always obliged to offer themselves to the priests of the temple. Not obliged, he says. And they had freedom to choose their patrons. And he says many of them some of them also prefer to remain celibate. Okay, so this is his description, and he was all praised for their performing arts of both dance and music. This was from his very close observations of the Devadasis too, attached to the temples. This may have happened, close observations may also be the reason for, I think it could have been contributed by the woman, a dancing girl. He had fallen in love, Mamia. Her name was Mamia. He gives details of this. and Mamya, whom he loved, and it was after her tragic death that he left India. Okay, so this is one different kind of a perception we actually come across. Excuse me. Well, insofar as the artists were concerned, several of the narratives, travel accounts or missionary accounts or any other, even other kinds of writings that reached these two countries, there were artists who also became highly curious about India. India was found to be very exotic also by them in these narratives, and they developed a growing interest insofar as India was concerned, and many of them also traveled to India, artists I'm speaking of, traveled to India with curiosity. Okay. Some of them, of course, were freelance. If some of them came with the permission of the East India Company, I'm talking of British here, if they come, and many of them were also freelance artists. So one of the earliest was that of art productions was that of Tilly Kettle. Tilly Kettle came to India with the permission of the East India Company, and he, like many of the other artists, covered landscapes, monuments, and portraits of the people. Interestingly, Kettle painted the daily lives of the people, and one of the paintings was on Sati, and of course paintings on dancing girls. Sati, of course, many of them may have found shocking, and what he had witnessed in South India, he painted, and two dancing girls performing on the streets of Madras were also painted by him. These were later, it may be Sati or the daily lives of the people, paintings of the daily lives of the people, and even of the two dancing girls performing on the streets of Madras, were displayed, exhibited at the Society of Artists in London in 1772. However, these illustrations of dancing girls were found very enigmatic as well as the profane by the public as well as the intellectuals there. Anyway, the Devadasis continued to be a figure of derision among several of the British scholars and artists. Okay, artists, I could say that even other paintings, if we take up paintings pertaining to the wars, for example, we have good number of paintings even of the wars, the Anglo-Mysore wars that came to be produced. And even there, the British are shown as mighty and powerful. And the rulers who were defeated were shown as very weak, and with victory of the British was important. That was the highlight. Anyway, among the scholars, British scholars, Monia Williams, I'm sure many of us have heard of him. And he also, while speaking of the Devadasis, says that the enormous wealth that was in the possession of the Devadasis was inconsistent with the women spending on the works of piety as well as public works. So he says that rather they were slaves of licentious passions of the priests in the temples they belonged to. Similar perceptions are also echoed by James Forbes. Okay, he was a British artist, a writer. In fact, he was a writer of the East India Company in India until 1784. And he also shared similar thoughts. Same thing came to be echoed. Okay. So such attitudes ran through most of the writings that were produced in the 18th and 19th centuries. And their notions were clearly reflected in the tendency of a superior feeling towards European culture and European civilization. This was a kind of a syndrome, I could say, that became highly magnified among the British in India. the Indians as uncivilized, Indians as uncultured, and such conceptions. Besides such conceptions, of course, it was, of course, about the Devadasis and the Devadasi practice itself. Okay, it became fundamental for them in the justification of imperial project in India. Okay, the Nach girls, as they called them, as they were no ordinary Nach girls, but yet the British called them so because they could not understand or differentiate among the various kinds of dances in India and classed all dances as Nach. And South Indian Devadasi dances could not be, though it could not be classified under Nach. And they also called them as temple prostitutes. And this, this for the British, became symbolic of Indian despotism and backwardness. It was a symbol of sensuousness of the Indian women. See, this is a blanket kind of a perception they had. So the position of women in the domestic space, as well as the position of women in the public space, came to be denigrated. And they were projected in such a way that it was a white man's burden upon the white man to uplift the women or to emancipate them from the practices that came to be imposed upon them. In fact, Gayatri Spivak speaks very well about it in her Can the Subaltern Speak, where she speaks of such in such a projection, particularly insofar as Sati was concerned, they expressed themselves in such a way that the British were rescuing the brown woman from the brown man. Okay, that is the brown woman, the Indian woman from the Indian man. We were called as not blacks. Okay, so this is how they conceptualized themselves also. If such were the perceptions of the English, insofar as the French were concerned, now coming to their conceptualizations, the subject of the Indian dancing girls caught the attention or imagination of the French artists, French writers, displayed immense enthusiasm in the Orient. And they found the culture very exotic and fascinating too. And this enthusiasm of theirs coincided with the Enlightenment thoughts of the times. In fact, one of the earliest playwrights to introduce the dancing girls in playwrights I'm speaking of, he was also a poet, a dramatist, okay, a polymath. He was, of course, a German who introduced the dancing girl theme in the plays, in the operas and ballets of the time. And operas andre Sangeeta Natakagalu. Okay. So in the ballets as well, and these dancing girls of South India are called as dancing girls were called as bayaderes. So the bayaderes were introduced on stage. Okay, so it was his libretto. Libretto is the scripts that came to be written. The libretto, the Indian legend, that is the German name also for it, and about the bayaderes. So this was staged several times, and the one who played the role of a bayadere, that is a dancing girl, was Mary Taglioni. In fact, she was the father of Taglioni, who was a renowned French dramatist. Okay. Besides Goethe, so this Indian legend, I'm sorry, was the script was written by libretto was Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. So Indians generally produce him as Goethe. Okay, it's not Goethe, it's Goethe. And Goethe was the one who had authored that script. It was his libretto, and it came to be staged several times by Mary Taglioni. And besides Goethe, there were other French librettists. That is, those who write librettists are those who write the scripts of the operas and ballets. So temple dancers of South India were introduced there through these ballets, ballet pradakshina nೃತ್ಯಗಳು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ಬೋದು. So interestingly, in 1838, for the first time, For the first time in 1838, 4 dancing girls and 3 musicians from South India, from Tiruvandipuram temple in Pondicherry, they were invited to France, to Paris. And an agreement was signed by Tardival, a French impresario. Impresario is one who organizes concerts. Okay, so this impresario invited them, and this agreement was signed. And for the first time, they left the borders of the country, entered Europe, and they were all very young girls, 18 years old, and only one among them was 25 years. Tillammal, Ammanni, Rangam, Sundaram, and Vedam. Vedam was a 6-year-old girl child who accompanied them. She was the granddaughter of a Natuvanar. Natuvanar are the ones who who direct the dance and music. So he also, Ramalinga Mudali, so she was the granddaughter of that Natuvanar. So the 3 musicians also accompanied them. This was the first professional Indian dance troupe to visit Europe. It was 1838. They were not regarded as or presented as ordinary dancing girls. In fact, they were presented as priestesses. There is
ಸೋಮವಾರ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಬೇಗ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೇನಾ? ಸೋಮವಾರ ಏನಿದೆ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕು?
Please
10 ಕಾಲಿಗೆ ಒಯ್ಯು.
go on mute.
Nagabhushan Gaud.
Okay, continue, ma'am.
Sorry about that. Anyway, for the first time, they were introduced by their real names. Ammani, Tillammal, Rangam, Sundaram, Vedam. These were their real names. And for the first time, because it so happens that many a time their names may have not been known to those attached to the temples in India, but they were introduced by their real names for the first time. And that was found exciting by these girls. So the 2 plays that came to be staged by these young dancing girls from South India one was Race for Rarity, or the Bayaderas, a race for rarity, or the Bayaderas. The other one was the Law of Brahma, or the Hindu Widow. Okay, these were the titles of the plays, 2 plays they staged. Okay, there was an overwhelming response in Paris. In fact, they were interviewed by journalists, and many others also spoke to them. They were honored even by the royalty. French French artists, writers, choreographers romanticized the Devadasis in practice. And they were later invited even to London, where they performed. And London also initially, they were a little reserved in welcoming these dancing girls. And later, there was a lot of appreciation that came to be earned by these girls. In fact, Ammani Ammal, who became so popular that there was even a sculpture. She was sculpted even in bronze. Okay, in Paris. So this is the kind of a reception that these dancing girls received in Paris. So this speaks of the perception of the Parisians or the French insofar as the dancing girls were concerned. Interestingly, the story, I'll just speak of just 2 stories. Okay, interesting stories for the operas and the ballets. Goethe's Indian legend. Okay, I'll come back to that. Indian legend speaks on, it rather narrates the story of Mahadeva, that is Shiva. And it is spelled as Mahado. So it is about Mahadeva. Mahadeva comes to earth disguised as a human. So a dancing girl offers him shelter and also extends wonderful hospitality to him, and also nourishes unselfish love for him. Well, Mahadeva, in order to test her devotion as well as fidelity, feigns to be dead. And this girl tries to climb the funeral pyre, unable to bear the death of the stranger that she would have met. So she tries to climb the pyre. And the priests, see, all these were staged in Paris, mind you. Okay. The priests tried to dissuade her, saying that she was no wife of that human. She was the wife of the immortal being, but yet she tries to climb the pyre, and then she casts herself on the pyre. Immediately, the god rises from the flames of the pyre and takes the girl to heaven, by which she will be liberated from her earthly ties and rewarded immortality because she is now taken by Mahadeva. So this is the story. There were several versions of this story that appeared. Okay, in one such opera, Shiva rises, and before taking her to heaven, this is another version, before taking her to heaven, commands that the event should be commemorated by dancers attached to two temples. Dancers attached to temples should commemorate this event. And then he states that, he announces that they should be called Devadasis. So this opera was first staged in 1810. And later, intermittently, it came to be staged till 1828, speaks of the popularity of these themes pertaining to the Devadasis. Very interesting is also the libretto of Victor Joseph Etienne da Joy. Okay, Joy was actually serving in the French army in India for several years. Later, he quit his job here and went back to France. And there, of course, he became a very famous dramatist. Okay. Very interesting. There are several plays, and I'm just picking on one or two of these. And it is one particular story that I'll speak of. This story pertains to a battle between the prince of Banaras and Olkar of the Maratha army. So the Devadasi, the prince of Banaras, his name was Demali, and in the war between Demali and Olkar, the entire theme is on that. Well, there also appears a dancing girl in this, and Demali, the prince, is very much fascinated by this dancing girl, Lamia. Her name is Lamia. And he proposes marriage to her, and she rejects this proposal, and she, being a Devadasi, is forbidden to marry a mortal. Still, she helps the prince, and with a group of others, she enters the camp of the enemy, that is Olkar's army, and by offering drinks, intoxicates all of them, and they are defeated in the war. So then the Prince Damali again proposes to marry her, but she refuses because she is already, being a Devadasi, she is already married to the immortal being. Then it is then that the priest comes forward, releases her from the ritualistic or the religious vows, and she is then married to the prince. So the highlight of the story is that the Devadasi, Lamia, devotion to the immortal being. So her refusal to marry a mortal being speaks of her devotion to the immortal being. And this is what Joey tries to highlight in this opera that came to be staged. Anyway, in the French portrayals, we come across the perceptions of the French being distinct from that of the British, absolutely distinct. In the French imaginaries, which are based mainly upon travel accounts, which came to be initially constructed, and then in these constructions, we come across India being looked upon as a cradle of humanity. And this also found its way into the scholarship as well as in the imagination of the people in France. But with Voltaire, there was a change in the attitude. The French were very much influenced by the philosophy of Voltaire. So this was the Enlightenment period. So his criticisms of European colonizations, European greed and brutality in the process of colonization. So such of the writings in a way impacted the people in France. And in fact, it is said that he opened the door for the French to India and to the spiritual heritage of India, which was found very fascinating for the French. Okay, and even the Vedas and such things. There were large number of such literature, ancient Indian literature, which came to be transported to Paris. But at that point of time, many of the French had not looked into this kind of the ancient literature. And it was only much later such discoveries came to be made after Voltaire began to speak of the rich spiritual heritage of India. Well, anyway, however, it is said that much of the French fixation, insofar as India was concerned, was it was formed in the shadow of a failed empire. That is what many of the scholars also say. They failed to establish an empire, to found an empire in India. And it was only because their efforts were scuttled by the British. And after the Anglo-Mysore War, they lost all opportunities of founding an empire in India. In fact, in several of the scripts and operas also, we find a critique of, there is an anti-British, there are anti-British expressions and a critique of the colonization by Britain of India. It was so unlike the British attitudes, so unlike the British attitudes. So, insofar as the British were concerned, it was their English supremacist attitudes in the writings, expressed in the writings as well as in the paintings. And this actually paved the way for the emergence of nationalist art in India. Because many of the paintings, and of course, even our own nationalist historiography, if we go through, it's obvious that Indians were on the defense. Okay, everything came to be defended. Everything came to be defended. And in fact, even from Raja Ram Mohan Roy, we find that social reform may have been launched, but sati system, he says, was not found in ancient India in the ancient past. It was only in the later periods. And this, many of them attributed to coming of foreigners from outside the country. Okay, so this is the kind of a very strong defense that came to be put up by the nationalists and even our nationalist historians. And we find highly, insofar even as the kings were concerned, glorified accounts. And in fact, as so far as the rulers of India were concerned, it is mainly hagiographical accounts, okay, that we find in our nationalist historiography as well. And all of us know about it. So it is only from the second half of the 19th century that this kind of a nationalist art in India also began to emerge, latter half of the 19th century. This was a response to the European descriptive art. Okay, so the way they projected Indians, so it was in response to that projection or the projection of descriptive arts. So and this was all India. I'm sorry. One important development. I'm just cutting short because it's time. I have just a few seconds. So one important development was that while denigrating everything about India, particularly the position of women and so on, it was in 19th century that the social purity movement had been launched in England and in other parts of Europe too. So in this kind, the social purity movement that came to be launched there had its influence even upon the Indians. So in India also, but the social purity movement came to be launched. And as part of the social purity movement was the anti-Devdasi movement, as well as from the anti-Devdasi to anti-Nach movement also came to be launched. And we know it happened in the presidency in South, Madras presidency too. So in course of time, there were several debates, and in Mysore state also the Wadayars acted, the Mysore government actually banned the practice of dance in temples and also singing in temples. And only those who had already been initiated could continue, but their practices were also highly restricted insofar as orders were passed in Mysore state. And similarly, efforts were happening even in the presidency regions also. And it so happened that all of us know about it, the kind of anti-Devdasi movement that came to be stand, self-respect movement also supported it, and Muthulakshmi Reddy also brought in a bill for the abolition of this practice. Well, it was going on, this strong debate was going on. And between the reformists on the one side and the Devadasis on the other, and supporters of Devadasis also were there in this kind of a dialogue that was taking place. Anyway, finally, it was in 1947 that in the presidency it came to be banned. Well, anyway, let me not go into any of those details, but to say that this practice had been what the British called as licentious and so on. It was never there. It was only in the course of time, particularly after, yes, it is very true that many of them took to prostitution also, because once the practice was banned and their means of living, the Inam lands and such of the donations that came to be, endowments that came to be extended to them were all stopped. So they were deprived of means of living too, and many of them were compelled to go into seeking other means for making a living. It's very true. And even in Kannada literature, we have significant references to it about how there was a deterioration even in their dance form. So with this, with pertaining to this, I would just make a brief reference to not just banning of these practices, but it so happened that the nationalists, particularly the upper caste nationalists, okay, tried to seize upon the dance form. The dance of the Devadasis was called as Sadir, and they brought in a transformation in this dance. And Rukmini Devi Arundel played a very significant role in this. And this new form of dance was given the name Bharatanatyam. Okay, and even the music of the Devadasis were also taken over, and a new form came to be given. And it was, of course, the upper echelons of the society. It became a monopoly of the upper echelons of the society. And for the first time, girls of the upper classes in the society were able to climb onto the stage. So this is the kind of a transformation that was brought in. And these custodians of arts, okay, the Devadasis, were disempowered, they were disenfranchised, they were left voiceless, and despite a strong defense put up by the Devadasis, particularly in Madras presidency, there are a good number of documents available in the Madras archives, and many of them are published. Even I have a set of those documents with me, and put up by the Devadasis in Madras, led by Bengaluru Nagaratnamma. They were unsuccessful, and they were slowly edged out of the cultural milieu of South India, rich cultural milieu of South India. And their lives and their rich contributions, I would end up saying that their performing arts were totally obliterated. Okay, and we do not come across any authentic voices later. So this was how the Devadasis came to be eliminated from the society. Whatever forms we come across in these very regions, it is there in almost all the states. Even now, we have not been able to get rid of it. They may have accrued from it, but nothing of there is nothing, no remnants of the culture of the Devadasis of the past. Absolutely no. Not even particularly their performing arts or the life that came to be led by them. There is absolutely no resemblance to what it was in the past. In spite of every effort that is being made by the governments, they have not been able to put an end to this practice, and it is going on. It may not be happening, dedication may not be happening in the temples, but it is happening within the homes, within the domestic space. So it is becoming indeed difficult to eliminate it, despite governmental efforts, legislative interventions, and several of the schemes that are being brought out, and the very significant role that NGOs are also playing. They have not been able to put an end to this practice in